You look up at a finished Gothic cathedral, and the story seems obvious. A community united by faith, pouring generations of devotion into stone. That story isn't false. But it leaves out the question that actually determines whether a cathedral gets built at all. Where did the money come from? Continuously, for anywhere from 50 to 300 years, in a world with no income tax, no construction loans, and no government capable of underwriting a project this size, because that's the real shape of the problem. A medieval bishop couldn't simply decide to build a cathedral and pay for it out of diocesan income. The scale of these buildings, Chartres, Cologne, Reims, Milan, routinely exceeded anything a single institution's regular revenue could cover, even spread across decades. So the money had to come from somewhere else, and the somewhere else turns out to be one of the more inventive financing systems of the medieval world, closer to a sustained, multi-generational fundraising campaign than to a single patron writing a check. Start with what people already assume, because it's not wrong, just incomplete. Cathedrals were genuinely acts of communal devotion. Ordinary townspeople did contribute labor, materials, and money. Medieval chroniclers describe nobles and commoners alike hauling carts of stone to building sites at Chartres in the 12th century, an event sometimes called the cult of the carts. Accounts that were likely embellished for effect even at the time, but that reflects something real. Cathedral building was, at least partly, a genuine mass mobilization of a community's effort, but mobilizing labor and mobilizing enough continuous cash to keep several hundred skilled stonemasons, carpenters, and glaziers employed for decades are two very different problems. Skilled masons needed to be paid in coin regularly, or they left for other work. Building a cathedral wasn't a weekend project a town could absorb around its normal economic life. It required something closer to a standing payroll, sustained for longer than most medieval institutions of any kind managed to survive. This is where the actual financial engineering comes in, and it starts with a specific fund most people have never heard of, the fabrica, Latin for workshop, but used across medieval Europe to mean the dedicated building fund of a cathedral. The fabrica wasn't just a pile of money, it was closer to a semi-independent financial institution, with its own officials, its own income streams, and its own long-term obligations, operating alongside the cathedral chapter, but with a distinct and specific purpose. Keep construction funded year after year, regardless of how the broader diocese was doing financially. So what actually fed the fabrica? Several income streams, layered together, and this is the part that reframes the whole picture. First, direct donations from the wealthy, nobles, merchants, sometimes kings, who gave money, land, or income-producing property, a mill, a vineyard, rental houses in town whose ongoing revenue was assigned permanently to the building fund. This wasn't a one-time gift so much as an endowment, functioning much like a modern donor setting up a fund that keeps paying out indefinitely. Second, indulgences. This is a detail that surprises a lot of people, because indulgences are usually associated with the scandal that helped trigger the Protestant Reformation centuries later, but the underlying practice, the church granting a reduction in the temporal penalty for sin in exchange for a pious act, and increasingly a monetary donation, had already become a genuine fundraising tool for building projects well before that later controversy. Bishops could authorize indulgences specifically tied to donating toward cathedral construction, effectively turning the building fund into something people paid into for a spiritual return rather than a material one. Third, and this is the mechanism that turns out to matter more than almost anything else, relics. Here's the counterintuitive part. The cathedral itself, the building everyone thinks of as the asset, was often less economically important than the small, specific object it was built to house. A cathedral with a genuinely famous relic wasn't just a place of worship, it was a pilgrimage destination, and pilgrimage was, in very direct economic terms, medieval tourism. Pilgrims traveled from other regions and other countries, and while they came for spiritual reasons, they still needed to eat, sleep, buy supplies, and, very often, make a donation at the shrine itself. A famous relic could turn a mid-sized town into a seasonal boom town, and the money generated by that traffic flowed, at least in part, directly back into the fabrica. Chartres Cathedral is the clearest illustration of exactly how powerful this mechanism could be, and it's worth walking through in detail because it shows the whole system working at once. Donation, relic economy, and civic ambition, all reinforcing each other in a single, well-documented sequence of events. Chartres already had an earlier cathedral on the site, and it already held a relic of major importance, the Sancta Camisa, believed to be the tunic worn by the Virgin Mary at the birth of Christ. This relic had made Chartres a significant pilgrimage site well before the building most people picture today existed. Then, in 1194, a catastrophic fire tore through the town and severely damaged the existing cathedral. Here's the turning point. According to accounts from the period, the relic was believed lost in the fire, and then found intact in the crypt days later. To a medieval audience, this wasn't a lucky coincidence. It was read as a direct sign that the Virgin herself wanted a new, greater cathedral cathedral built on the site to house it. Whatever the precise chain of events, the effect on fundraising was immediate and dramatic. Chroniclers describe a surge of donations from across the region and beyond, nobility, clergy, and ordinary townspeople all contributing alongside reported bursts of volunteer labor. The practical result: the main structure of Chartres Cathedral, as it stands largely today, went up in a period of roughly 25 to 30 years, remarkably fast for a Gothic cathedral of that scale, most of which took far longer or were never fully completed at all. That speed wasn't primarily a matter of superior engineering or a larger workforce alone. It was a direct consequence of an unusually strong, relic-driven fundraising surge that kept the fabrica flush with cash during the critical early decades when momentum mattered most. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it inverts the intuitive story. The building didn't attract the relic. The relic, and the dramatic story attached to it after the fire, effectively funded the building. The most economically significant object at Chartres, in terms of what it generated in donations and pilgrim traffic, may well have been a small piece of cloth in a reliquary, not the 100+ meter stone structure built around it. And this pattern repeated, in weaker or stronger forms, across medieval Europe. Cathedral chapters actively competed to acquire, display, and promote relics, sometimes sending them on tour, a practice called equate, where a relic was carried through surrounding towns and regions specifically to solicit donations from communities that couldn't visit Chartres itself. It functioned, in a very real sense, like a medieval fundraising road trip with the relic as the draw. So now you have the full financing stack: wealthy patrons providing large, often income-generating endowments, indulgences monetizing spiritual practice directly into the building fund, and relics generating a recurring, self-sustaining stream of pilgrim income that could, in a good case, fund construction for a generation or more. But this system had a structural vulnerability, and it's the same one that shows up whenever an institution's income depends heavily on popularity rather than something more stable. If the donations slowed, or a rival shrine drew pilgrims away, or a city's wealth declined, or political conflict disrupted trade and travel, the fabrica's income could collapse. And unlike a modern construction project, there was no mechanism to simply halt work cleanly and resume it later at full efficiency. A half-built cathedral wasn't a paused asset sitting safely in storage. It was exposed stonework, incomplete vaulting, and standing scaffolding that could deteriorate, all while continuing to require some level of maintenance spending just to keep what had already been built from falling apart. This is exactly what happened at Cologne. Construction of Cologne Cathedral began in 1248 with the same basic financing model as Chartres: donations, indulgences, and the pull of significant relics. Cologne held what were believed to be the relics of the Three Kings, or Magi, a genuinely major medieval pilgrimage draw. For a while, the model worked, and substantial portions of the building went up, including the choir, completed and consecrated in the early 14th century. Then the money slowed. Historians point to a combination of factors: shifting religious and civic priorities, the enormous and rising cost of an increasingly ambitious design, and simply the difficulty of sustaining fundraising momentum across generations once the original burst of enthusiasm faded. By around 1473, construction had effectively stalled. Not stopped in the sense of a clean pause, stalled in the sense of grinding down to a crawl and then essentially freezing in place. And it stayed that way for close to 400 years. For most of that time, Cologne Cathedral stood as a landmark of visible, permanent incompleteness. Half a facade, a massive medieval construction crane left standing atop the unfinished south tower for so long that it became, itself, a recognizable feature of the city's skyline for generations of residents who had never seen it any other way. It wasn't finished until the 19th century, when a very different set of motivations, German nationalism and a Romantic-era revival of interest in Gothic architecture, finally supplied the funding and cultural will to complete it in 1880, using construction plans that had, remarkably, survived from the medieval period. Put those two cases side by side, and the underlying economics come into sharp focus. Chartres succeeded because a specific, dramatic, well-timed event supercharged its fundraising exactly when the project needed it most. Cologne stalled not because the ambition was unreasonable or the relics weren't significant, but because sustaining that level of financial commitment across many decades without a comparable galvanizing event was extraordinarily difficult, and Cologne's stall wasn't the exception. It was closer to the norm. A large number of Gothic cathedral projects across medieval Europe were scaled back from their original designs, left with mismatched towers where money ran out partway through a redesign or simply never completed as originally planned. The finished, harmonious cathedrals people picture, the ones that appear on postcards, represent the successful outliers, not the typical outcome. This also explains a detail about cathedral architecture that looks like an aesthetic choice but is really an economic one. The visibly mismatched towers you'll notice on a number of medieval cathedrals cathedrals, where one tower is taller, more ornate, or built in a visibly different style than the other. That's rarely intentional design. It's usually the physical record of a fundraising gap, one tower completed during a period of strong income, the other finished decades or even centuries later under a different bishop with different money and often a different architectural fashion entirely. So what did it actually mean to be the person, the bishop, the cathedral chapter, the fabrica's administrators, responsible for one of these projects? In the best case, you inherited or acquired a genuinely significant relic, caught a wave of civic and religious enthusiasm at the right moment, secured strong endowed income alongside it, and rode that momentum through the most expensive early phases of construction before enthusiasm inevitably cooled. Chartres is close to that best case. The more realistic case, and the more common one across medieval Europe, involved exactly the pattern Cologne experienced: an ambitious start, genuine early progress, and then a slow financial exhaustion as the initial burst of donations and indulgence income tapered off faster than construction costs did. The result wasn't usually total abandonment. A half-built cathedral was too significant, both spiritually and civically, simply to walk away from, but rather decades or centuries of intermittent, underfunded work. A few years of progress whenever a wealthy patron died and left a bequest, or a new bishop arrived with fresh fundraising energy, followed by long stretches of near standstill. So return to that opening image, a community united by faith, building something magnificent for God. That's real, and it mattered. The labor, the devotion, the genuine mass participation described in the Chronicles weren't fabricated. But underneath that image was a financial operation that had to solve a problem most institutions in history never had to face. How do you fund a single continuous project across timescales longer than most human lifespans in an economy without the modern financial tools built for exactly that kind of long-horizon commitment? The answer medieval Europe arrived at was a strange, effective, and fragile hybrid. Permanent endowed income, monetized spiritual practice through indulgences, and, most powerfully and most precariously, the pull of a relic capable of turning an ordinary town into a recurring pilgrimage economy. When that combination aligned, as it briefly and spectacularly did at Chartres, a cathedral could rise in a single generation. When it didn't, as at Cologne, the half-finished result could stand as an unintentional monument for centuries, not to failure exactly, but to just how difficult and how financially precarious the entire project always was. A cathedral wasn't simply a building funded by faith. It was medieval Europe's largest and longest-running economic gamble, and the stone soaring overhead was never really separate from the fundraising campaign underneath it. It was the fundraising campaign made permanent in stone.